December 2, under the cold concrete of Stagg Field, University of Chicago, Illinois. The air is damp and smells faintly of sawdust and graphite. Naked bulbs hang overhead, casting hard white circles across a curious wooden structure rising toward the low ceiling. To anyone walking in off the street, it would look like a bizarre stack of black bricks and lumber, tiered like a stepped pyramid. To the men gathered around it, it is something far more dangerous. Chicago pile number 1. Enrico Fermi stands at the base of the pile, wire-rimmed glasses catching the yellow light. His hands are steady, but his voice, when he speaks, is so soft that everyone leans in to hear. "All right, gentlemen, we begin." A chalkboard on the wall is already covered in numbers. Another physicist, WWII, grips a long wooden handle attached to a cadmium control rod that slides into the heart of the pile. Overhead, a heavy emergency safety rod hangs on a rope, held in place by a graduate student perched on a platform. They call him the Suicide Squad. If something goes wrong, he will cut the rope. The rod will slam down, poisoning the reaction. If he hesitates, everyone in this room might die. You can almost feel the weight of that rope in his sweating fingers. Around the room, men in baggy coats and loosened ties exchange glances. Arthur Compton, head of the Chicago Metallurgical Project, stands near the door, trying to look calm. Leo Szilard paces softly, nervously folding his hands, flattening them again, as if he could press his fears into the concrete floor. A Geiger counter ticks quietly on a table, its operator watching the needle as if it were the pulse of a patient on the edge of death. Outside, winter grips Chicago. Students hurry past Stagg Field, scarves pulled tight, unaware that in the shadowed bowels of their university, the world is about to change forever. Inside, Fermi nods to Weil. "Pull the control rod to mark A." Weil pulls. Wood scrapes. Graphite dust floats lazily in the beam of a single bulb. The rod slides out a few inches. The Geiger counter begins to tick faster. A recorder calls out the readings. Another man writes them in a notebook: time, rod position, neutron intensity. Fermi listens, brow furrowed, doing calculations in his head. He looks almost bored, as if this were a classroom exercise instead of the first deliberate attempt to coax a chain reaction into running on its own. In truth, everyone in this room understands what is at stake. If the calculation is wrong, if the reaction races out of control, no one knows exactly what will happen. Will it simply overheat and melt the pile? Will it blast the room with invisible radiation? Or could it somehow ignite the air itself? A nightmare that had haunted some of their earlier discussions. Fermi raises a hand for silence. Again. "Pull to mark B." Weil obeys. The rod moves. The ticking quickens. The needle climbs. Each line on the chart edges higher, approaching the point that Fermi has predicted with cold, mathematical confidence. He asks for another adjustment, then another. Each time, the pile responds like a living thing, its neutron population growing, settling, growing again. At one point, Fermi pauses the experiment, ordering the rod pushed all the way back in. The Geiger counter calms, the needle sinking. A collective breath escapes the room, one nobody realized they were holding. On a nearby bench, someone jokes weakly about lunch. No one laughs. Then Fermi looks up, eyes bright. "We proceed to critical..." Those words hang in the air. Critical, self-sustaining, a chain reaction that feeds itself, no longer needing human hands to nudge it along. Weil pulls the control rod once more, slowly, at Fermi's direction. The pile responds. The ticking blends into a frantic buzz. The recorder's pencil races across the page as the numbers accelerate, then, almost impossibly, begin to stabilize at a higher level. Fermi studies the plot. He takes a slide rule, makes a few final calculations, and, with the calm of a man confirming a sunrise, turns to Compton. The reaction is self-sustaining. He checks his watch. The pile has gone critical at 3:25 p.m. For the first time, the room truly understands. The world now contains a controlled nuclear fire, burning quietly beneath a football stadium. No mushroom cloud, no flash, only numbers on the paper and a faint, steady whisper from the Geiger counter. Far across the Pacific, in Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence officers continue to file their reports, convinced that American physics is years behind the theoretical brink. In this cramped Chicago room, that illusion has just died, even if no one outside these walls yet knows it. Fermi allows the reaction to run for a few minutes more. Then, with a final order, he has the control rod pushed back in. The ticking slows. The invisible fire dims, and the first man-made chain. Reaction in history falls silent. The silence that follows feels heavier than the concrete above their heads. The Geiger counter falls quiet, and with it, the nervous chatter. For a moment, the men under Stagg Field simply stand there, listening to the hum of the building, to their own breathing. They are standing inside a milestone that feels oddly ordinary. No flash, no roar, just a line in a notebook and a time on Fermi's watch. Arthur Compton breaks the spell. "All right, gentlemen," he says, voice thick. "I think this calls for a report." They move out of the squash court, one by one, past the rough brick walls and up the narrow stairway toward the dim light of the corridor above. Behind them, the wooden pile sits in the half-darkness, quiet and unassuming, like a sleeping animal that has briefly opened one eye. In a small office nearby, Compton closes the door and reaches for the telephone. The war has turned telephones into potential weapons for the enemy, so nothing important can ever be said plainly. That is why he already has the agreed code lying in his mind. Ready. The line crackles as it connects to James Conant in Washington. "Is that you, Arthur?" "Yes," Compton replies, steadying himself. The Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. There is a heartbeat of silence. Then Conant asks, playing his part, "How were the natives?" "Very friendly." Compton answers, allowing himself the ghost of a smile. "We had a fair wind, on the other end of the line, hundreds of miles away." The meaning sinks in. Enrico Fermi, the Italian navigator, has landed. The voyage into the heart of the atom has reached its first safe harbor. The first controlled chain reaction in history is now a fact, within hours. The message ripples quietly through a small circle of men. General Leslie Groves, the hard-driving head of the Manhattan Engineer District, receives the news with a curt nod. To him, this is not a poetic milestone, but a green light. If Fermi can build a pile under a football stadium, Groves reasons, he can build several under military guard. If a stack of graphite and uranium can maintain a chain reaction, then perhaps they can refine the stuff inside those black bricks into something far more concentrated, something that could fit into the nose of a bomber. He does not say any of this on paper. He does not have to. The war is at its height. The Japanese Empire still bestrides the Western Pacific. German U-boats prowl the Atlantic. American bombers are only just beginning to taste battle in Europe and the Pacific skies. Every step from this moment forward will be wrapped in secrecy. Back in Chicago, that secrecy settles like a second layer of concrete over Stagg Field. The men involved are reminded that what they witnessed today cannot be spoken of to wives, to friends, to anyone not cleared. Their work will be hidden behind euphemisms, behind harmless-sounding labels like metallurgical laboratory. Outside, students laugh and shout and hurry across the quad, their breath steaming in the cold air. Somewhere a football thumps. The ordinary world has not changed yet, but a clock has started ticking. Far away, in Tokyo, Intelligence officers sit in cramped rooms filled with cigarette smoke and stacks of intercepted reports. Charts on the wall-track American shipbuilding, aircraft production, convoy routes. They have estimates for steel output, oil refining, bomber range. But for this thing that has just come to life under a Chicago stadium, they have only shadows. A few scattered reports mention that prominent European physicists have moved to the United States. Some attachés in Washington have noted university buildings under new military security. There are rumors of an unusual Army Corps of Engineers district with no obvious geographic area to manage. From these scraps, a few Japanese analysts speculate about advanced explosives or perhaps new kinds of radar. Nuclear fission is known in a theoretical way. There have even been small programs in Japan to investigate it. But the idea that the Americans could now sustain a chain reaction in a constructed pile of uranium and graphite feels distant, improbable, years away at best. The truth, for the moment, is buried in a squash court under Stagg Field, in handwritten notes and a chalked timeline on a board. The physicists in Chicago will celebrate that night with a modest bottle of wine passed around. The bottle lifted in a tired, quiet toast to themselves. They are scientists who have just opened a door. To Groves and the military, they are the first step in building a weapon that might end the war. To Japanese intelligence, listening in the dark, that door does not yet exist. In the weeks that follow, the squash court under Stagg Field becomes less a laboratory and more a shrine to a new kind of fire. Guards appear at the doors. Identification checks become stricter. Conversations trail off whenever an unfamiliar footstep sounds in the corridor. Fermi and his team return to the pile again and again, refining measurements, learning its moods. The black graphite blocks absorb and reflect the light from the dangling bulbs, giving the impression of something ancient and monolithic, as if a temple had been built in the bowels of an American university. Yet as the calculations sharpen in Chicago, across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, a different kind of calculation occupies other minds. Berlin, early winter. Frost rims the windows of a research office where a German physicist, papers spread across his desk, rubs tired eyes and stares at a set of equations that have begun to feel like accusations. German science was once the envy of the world, before the war. Names like Heisenberg and Hahn commanded instant respect. Now, many of those brilliant colleagues are gone, driven abroad by the new regime, or silenced, or placed under strict direction of the Army Ordnance Office. There had been a moment, in the early days after fission was discovered, when some German scientists realized what might be possible. A machine that could tap the energy inside the atom, a bomb powered by that same unleashed force. Reports were written. Memoranda circulated. An experimental program was begun. But war, resources, priorities, and fear twisted everything. The leadership wanted quick weapons, not long, uncertain projects. Some scientists themselves, unsure and cautious, underestimated how rapidly such a program could proceed. In this cramped office, the physicist traces a finger across a diagram of a uranium machine. There was talk of building a large assembly with heavy water, of isolating material that might sustain a chain reaction. There were even vague rumors, carried by diplomatic channels before war closed the borders, that the British and Americans were interested in similar work. Still, it feels remote. Britain is under bombardment. The United States, though industrially powerful, is often dismissed in Berlin as technically crude, rich in factories but poor in refined theory. The German program moves forward, but without urgency. No vast public works site, no enormous concentration of effort, just scattered laboratories, modest reactors on paper, a trickle of funding controlled by officers who think in terms of artillery and tanks. Meanwhile, far to the east, in Tokyo, the city is wrapped in darkness during night air raid drills. Inside a quiet room in the Naval General Staff building, a handful of officers sit around a long table. Maps are pinned to the walls. A clock ticks, second by second, toward an uncertain end. A scientific advisor stands at the head of the table, bowing slightly before he begins. He speaks of uranium, of recent discoveries in Europe, of the possibility that the energy in the nucleus might, in theory, be used for power or even for a bomb of unimaginable force. He is careful. Japan fights on a knife edge of industrial resources. Steel, oil, rubber, copper, all are rationed. The Navy is already stretched to produce carriers and battleships, to maintain aviation fuel. To propose a vast new program based on theoretical physics feels nearly absurd. An admiral leans back, the fabric of his uniform whispering against the chair. "You are saying," he asks slowly, "that with a special kind of uranium, one could make a bomb that might decide a war in a single blow. In principle, yes," the advisor replies. "But the technical difficulties are enormous. It might require factories on a scale we cannot currently imagine. Many years of work, and we are not certain of the final outcome." Around the table, heads nod. Japan is already committed to a massive struggle across half the globe. To divert scarce steel and copper to a speculative project inside the atom seems like madness. The admiral sighs. "Interesting," he says, in the tone of a man shelving an exotic perfume for some distant parade. "But not for this war. The idea is noted, classified, filed under research of low priority. A handful of Japanese scientists will tinker with uranium in quiet laboratories. But no empire-shaking project will follow. None of the men in that room know that." On a cold December afternoon in Chicago, a group of physicists have already coaxed a chain reaction to sustain itself, using a pile of graphite and uranium beneath the stands of a football field. If any of them were to stand there, under those concrete arches, feel the faint rumble of trucks overhead and the quiet ticking of the counters beside the pile, they might sense the magnitude of the gap opening between their assumptions and reality. But in Berlin and Tokyo, the war is still thought of in terms of ships, planes, guns, and oil. The atom, for now, is regarded as a curiosity, a distant promise that will have to wait for another generation. While under Stagg Field, the future is already humming. The celebration under Stagg Field is brief. Within days, Fermi and his colleagues are already talking of something larger, something that will not fit beneath a university stadium. Chicago Pile 1 becomes a proof, a first spark. Now the order from above is simple and brutal. Make more, make bigger. You can almost see the trail it leaves, from the quiet courts under Stagg Field to rough new barracks at a forested site outside the city, where a new reactor is already taking shape. The work shifts out of the heart of the campus, away from curious students. Trucks roll in at night, laden with graphite blocks and uranium, headlights hooded. Men in uniform check manifests under low lamps. General Groves walks the muddy ground of future secret sites with his overcoat collar turned up against the wind. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, a raw scar carved out of valleys and farm fields, where entire towns seem to rise overnight. Hanford on the Columbia River, a stark landscape of sagebrush and wind where concrete and steel begin to climb out of the soil. Engineers talk in terms of flow rates and cooling water, of power levels that make the tiny Chicago pile look like a toy. The new reactors will be monsters, eating uranium and spitting out something far more concentrated. Plutonium, a word that still sits unfamiliar on most tongues, begins to appear in planning documents written in careful, coded language. Inside the labs, the scientists feel the scale change in their bones. In Chicago, they could stand near the pile, listen to the whisper of detectors, watch the black blocks glow dully under the lamps. At these new sites, control rooms will be separated from the reactor cores by thick walls and distance. Instruments will speak for the reaction, not eyes and ears. Secrecy wraps around all of this like winter fog. Workers at Oak Ridge arrive by train and bus, pass through checkpoints, live in hastily built houses where they are told only what they must know. Some spend their days adjusting valves and monitoring gauges, never being told what the great machines around them are truly for. They speculate quietly in crowded cafeterias, but the official line is always the same. War work. Important. Do not ask questions. Back in Chicago, Fermi grows thinner, more tired, as he travels between sites, offering advice on design, solving problems with quick sketches and spare words. There is pride in what he has set in motion, but also a weight that settles deeper each week. This is no longer pure inquiry. Every calculation, every refinement, is now tied by invisible wires to bombers, to distant cities, to the bodies of men who will live or die when this project reaches its end. Across the ocean, the ripples are faint and distorted. German analysts hear that somewhere in the United States a mysterious industrial area has appeared in the Tennessee hills, swallowing thousands of workers and mountains of material. They note the construction of vast new electric lines feeding a place that does not appear on ordinary maps. In Tokyo, naval and army intelligence files collect similar fragments. Reports from consuls and commercial agents mention that certain valleys in the American interior are suddenly closed to all visitors, that entire communities have been relocated with unusual speed. Japanese staff officers, already drowning in data about ship production and aircraft losses, shrug and chalk it up to yet another munitions plant, perhaps a center for new explosives or aircraft engines. A few technical advisors raise questions. Why so much electrical power for an explosives plant? Why place it inland, far from ports? Why the strange insistence on absolute secrecy among ordinary factory workers? Their memos are filed, acknowledged, and quietly buried under more pressing concerns like carrier losses, fuel convoys, and the need for better radar. War has its own gravity. For Tokyo, the urgent needs of today pull attention away from a vague, distant threat that lives in equations and construction blueprints. For Groves and his scientists, urgency flows the other way, drawing every resource and mind they can find into the heart of the hidden project. At night, under bright work lights in Tennessee and on the Columbia, welders send fountains of sparks against the dark. The reactors rise, silent and massive, like unfinished monuments. Few of the men wielding torches and dragging cables know it, but they are giving shape and muscle to the quiet fire that Fermi first coaxed into life under the stands of Stagg Field. The gap between what America is building and what its enemies imagine grows wider with every pour of concrete. Tokyo, August 1945. Night presses against the blackout curtains of the underground command center. The air smells of sweat, stale tobacco, and the faint tang of damp concrete. Maps of the Pacific litter the walls, their edges curling, riddled with colored pins that once marked bold advances. Now the pins cluster around Japan itself, like a tightening noose. A staff officer hurries down the corridor, boots slapping against the floor, clutching a folder stamped with fresh urgency. He pauses at a guarded door, whispers to the sentry, then steps inside a room where senior Army and Navy officers sit around a long table. Their faces are tired, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. On the table before them lie fresh reports from Hiroshima. They have already heard the first sketches. A single American bomber, a single bomb, a light brighter than anything the witnesses had imagined, followed by a pressure wave that smashed buildings as if they were made of paper. Fires that rose into a strange column. Entire districts flattened in an instant. Now, a scientific advisor stands beside the table, hands trembling ever so slightly as he distributes translated excerpts from Allied radio broadcasts and intercepted news bulletins. Words in careful script capture phrases that seem to have drifted in from another century. Atomic bomb, harnessing the energy of the atom, based on experiments begun years earlier. One admiral lifts a page closer, squinting. Experiments begun when, he asks. The advisor clears his throat. His voice is low, as if saying the date too loudly might change it. There is mention, sir, of a first controlled nuclear chain reaction in the United States. Chicago, the 2nd day of the 12th month, 1942. The room goes very still. For a moment, the only sound is the muffled thump of distant footsteps and a faint hum from ventilation fans. The officers around the table stare at him, then at one another, as if checking whether they heard correctly. 42, an Army general repeats. That is nearly 3 years ago. The advisor nods, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. It appears they achieved a self-sustaining reaction beneath a stadium at the University of Chicago. A structure called a pile, made of uranium and graphite. The description is clinical, but the meaning is clear. They began walking down this road long before we understood how far it might lead. An older admiral, his uniform hanging a little loose on him now, exhales slowly and sinks back in his chair. He remembers the meeting years earlier, the one where a young scientist had spoken of uranium and the possibility of terrible new weapons. Interesting, but impractical. They had decided a matter for another war, another age. Now that decision presses on his chest like a stone. You are certain these reports are accurate? He asks, as certain as one can be, given the sources. The advisor replies. The Americans speak of it openly now. They describe a team of physicists. A man named Fermi leads the experiment. They call it the first pile. They say that once it succeeded, they began building larger devices, reactors, to produce material for atomic weapons. The general who had scoffed at the date leans forward, knuckles white on the tabletop. 3 years, he murmurs. All that time, while we worried about tank production and shipyards, they were burrowing into the heart of the atom. Another officer, a younger colonel with a clipped mustache, shakes his head slowly, anger pushing through his fatigue. We underestimated the Americans, he says. We thought them industrially strong but scientifically clumsy. We believed that our own physicists, if properly directed, could match anything they did. Yet while we argued over the feasibility of a theoretical bomb, they were already running reactors in secret valleys. His fist taps the report. Under a football stadium, he adds bitterly. Not in a mountain fortress or a great laboratory, but under a place where students watched games, silence settles again. But it feels different now. Before, there had been a grim acceptance of conventional defeat, of losing ships faster than they could be built, of pilots going to battle with fewer and fewer resources. Now there is something else layered on top of that, the crushing realization that for years, an invisible race had been underway, one that the Japanese command never truly entered. An army officer who has remained quiet until now finally speaks, his voice hoarse. If they began in 42, then by the time our technical committees reviewed nuclear research in 43 and 44, the outcome was already decided. He says, we debated whether to allocate a few laboratories and small sums. They were already pouring rivers of money and steel into hidden sites. The scientific advisor nods grimly. He has seen the fragmentary estimates, vast quantities of electricity consumed by single American facilities, towns built from nothing in remote valleys, warehouses full of specialized equipment, things his own country could scarcely dream of supporting while fighting across such a wide front. The admiral at the head of the table closes his eyes briefly, seeing not the cramped concrete room but an imagined scene beneath an American stadium. Men in lab coats, a pile of black blocks, an unremarkable afternoon in winter when a quiet voice confirmed that a chain reaction had become self-sustaining. All while Japanese ships steamed toward Guadalcanal, while planners drew lines on maps of the Indian Ocean, while speeches spoke confidently of final victory. He opens his eyes again, but the room seems smaller now, the maps on the walls more fragile. The war he thought he understood has shifted beneath his feet. It is no longer just a contest of fleets and armies. It was also, all along, a race inside matter itself, begun in secret, run for years in silence, and ended in a flash over Hiroshima. For the men in the Tokyo map room, the reports from Hiroshima and Chicago feel like a verdict delivered from another universe. On the pages before them, the story unfolds in fragments translated from American announcements and Allied broadcasts. They read of a cold afternoon in Chicago, of a room under a stadium where a strange structure of graphite and uranium rose toward a low ceiling. They read that a handful of physicists gathered there with slide rules and counters, coaxing invisible particles into a steady dance. They read that at 3:25 in the afternoon on the 2nd of December, 1942, a man named Fermi declared that a chain reaction had become self-sustaining. One general traces that line with his finger again and again, as if the motion might change the date. It began there, he mutters. Under their football field, in his mind, he sees the same years as lines on the maps that surround him. While Japanese troops advanced through the Philippines, while carriers struck at the Indian Ocean, while soldiers fought through jungle and coral, there was another front, unseen and unacknowledged. The Americans had placed their flag not on an island, but inside the nucleus of uranium. A staff officer, younger than most in the room, imagines the scene more vividly. He has never seen an American university, but he pictures a stadium on a winter day, empty stands looming above, concrete sweating in the cold. Beneath those stands, in a cramped court, a group of men in worn suits and lab coats watch a needle climb and settle. When Fermi glances at his watch and speaks in that quiet voice, the young officer understands that a new kind of countdown began, not to an attack on a harbor, not to a fleet action, but to a bomb falling from a lone bomber over a Japanese city. Across the Pacific, the men who stood with Fermi under Stagg Field received the news from Hiroshima with their own mixture of awe and dread. Some had guessed this day would come when construction began at the great secret sites. Others had tried to hold on to the hope that the war might end before the weapon was needed. Now they read the casualty estimates, hear the descriptions of a city flattened in a single instant. They remember the soft ticking of Geiger counters in that squash court, the way the first graph of a sustained reaction had seemed almost modest. They had handled numbers and equations. The bomb turns those abstract figures into burned streets and shadows on walls. Fermi himself walks through corridors in wartime offices and project sites, hearing colleagues talk in low voices about military necessity, about lives saved by a shorter war. The logic is harsh and compelling, yet he cannot forget the peculiar stillness of that December moment in Chicago when the human race first learned it could start and control a nuclear fire. In prisoner of war camps and interrogation rooms after the surrender, Allied officers listen as German and Japanese scientists describe their own efforts. The pattern is always the same. Scattered research, modest piles on paper, committees that decided the challenge was too great for a nation already strained by total war. Many of them are stunned to learn that the Americans not only built a working pile in 1942, but did so in such an unassuming place. To them, the Chicago experiment feels like the quiet opening of a door they had barely approached. To their commanders, reading the post-war reports, it becomes a symbol of misjudgment. They had underestimated the capacity of American industry to marry brute production with advanced theory. They had clung to an image of the enemy as a giant of factories and a child in refined science. The truth had sat under a stadium, hidden behind brick walls and armed guards, humming softly in the language of neutrons and graphite. Years later, visitors will walk across the campus where Stagg Field once stood. Some will pause at a simple marker, perhaps at a sculpture that hints at the shape of a reaction no longer contained. They will read a date, a place, a brief explanation of what happened there. It will not mention the map room in Tokyo, where officers first realized that this quiet experiment had outrun their own plans by years. It will not list the names of the Japanese analysts who stared at the date 1942 and understood, too late, that an invisible race had begun without them. But if you stand there and close your eyes, you might still imagine the dim light of that squash court, the rough smell of graphite, the murmur of voices as Fermi checked his watch and pronounced that the pile was critical. In that moment, the war did not end, and no city burned. Yet the path to both victory and devastation took a sharp, irrevocable turn, one that stunned American enemies when they finally traced it back to its source. Not to a battlefield, not to a harbor, to a hidden room under a stadium on a winter afternoon in Chicago.